Everyone excited for the next session? So, raise of hands, who works with NgRx at the moment? Good, you're in the right session then, that's good. Just making sure that people aren't just sitting here because it's a long way to the other room. It's a very long way, I know. That's why I'm not going to move further than there. Also because this is going to be a very exciting talk. Without further ado, please welcome Mike to the stage to talk about complexity management with NgRx.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by telling you a story from early on in my career. When I first got out of college, this may surprise you, but I actually worked for the US Army. Now, let me clear up any misconceptions right now. I was not a soldier. I mean, look at me. I'm not an American soldier material. No, I was a software engineer working for the US Army's video game studio. I don't know if you knew that we had one of those in our Army, but it's true. That's where I worked. And being fresh out of college, I was ready to take on the world. And that led me into kind of an awkward pickle because it turns out that I would soon become the lead JavaScript engineer for a really big social media app written in AngularJS. And I kind of got the role because I was ambitious and I was one of the few people at the studio really playing with single-page applications at the time. But being fresh out of college, still my reaction was dread and panic. I was so not prepared for this undertaking. So what did I build? What did I build for my first AngularJS application? Well, it may look familiar to you. I built an absolute mess of an AngularJS application. I mean, truly a disaster. But some good news. Even though I built a mess, it was shipped. I actually delivered that application, and people got value from it. So okay, maybe there's an upside to this story. But there's another downside, because we shipped it, but since we shipped it, it hasn't been updated in 5 years. Like, we shipped it, and that was the end of it. It hasn't been updated since. So what went wrong in this application? Well, there were 3 things that went wrong with the app that I built and led the architecture for. The first was that I built something that was extremely difficult to debug. I'm talking about hard-to-trace race conditions, full of bad HTTP requests and promise-based code. It was really, really messy. It was also really hard to trace data changes in this application. How data flowed between services and components was just not really well organized. And of course, like most AngularJS applications at the time, mine certainly lacked unit tests. And I don't know if you've ever heard the idiom that a legacy app is one that's missing unit tests. I definitely built a legacy app right off the bat. So I kind of like to think that what I built was a plate of spaghetti. It's tasty, it gives you sustenance, you get some value from it, but when you really start to zoom in on a plate of spaghetti, well, I'm sorry, it just kind of starts to look a little gross. You don't know where it begins or ends, and if you want to make changes to this, it's not going to be an ideal place to start. So from that point forward, I knew that I wanted to do something different when I built UI applications, if I was put in that space. I wanted to build lasagnas. Yes, it's true, but let me explain. You see, I wanted a smart, layered approach to building highly interactive Angular applications. I didn't want to get myself in that same mess next time. So how did I do it? Well, first, let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Ryan. You can follow me on Twitter, GitHub, and Medium at MikeRyanDev. I'm a software architect at an IoT company called Synapse, where I'm working on building the industrial Internet of Things. I'm also a Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies, and I'm one of the founders of the NgRx project. And NgRx is really what I want to talk to you about today. For those who are not aware, NgRx is a collection of open source libraries for Angular. And the goal of NgRx is to bring reactivity to the parts of the framework that don't have it today. We're primarily known for maintaining state and handling side effects in your Angular applications, but we also have libraries for handling collections, managing router state, and of course, code generation. It's also completely community-driven. No one gets paid to work on NgRx. That means if you want to get involved, it's open source. You can jump on the GitHub and participate just like I've managed to do. So how have I used NgRx to manage complexity since that first project? Well, I want to pull a quote out of one of my favorite papers. It's by authors Ben Mosley and Peter Marks, and it's called Out of the Tar Pit. And in it, they say that complexity is the single major difficulty in the successful development of large-scale software. It's kind of an interesting quote, but there's a few parts of this I want to unpack. Namely, I want to try and give you a definition for what is a large-scale application. Because you often hear people say, oh, NgRx is only for big apps. Well, what does a big app really mean? Are you working on a big app or not? So when I think of big applications in my time, like what are the things that I consider big? It's been really based on two different axes. The first is the size of the team. That has a big impact on the size of the project. And the second is how long we spent working on that project. You see, if we take this and break it down, we can start to figure out what's the small, medium, or large-sized application. A small app might be one that's built by just yourself or maybe a small team of developers for a short amount of time. That medium-sized application, on the other hand, either has maybe a larger team, or it can still be a small team, but they're working on it for longer, and so they've grown a medium-scale application. And those large applications, they're not exclusive to big organizations. You can be on a small team, but maintaining the same piece of code for years and effectively create some of the same problems you'd experience in a big org. So we are all in the potential situation to work on large-scale applications. And I want to clarify something. All software is hard. Large-scale is not special. It just has a different set of challenges to it. So there's nothing inherently unique about large-scale software in terms of the complexity. It's just got those different challenges. So if we go back to this pull quote, well, now we kind of understand what I mean when I say large-scale software. But now we have to identify that piece of complexity. Where does complexity come from? How do we introduce complexity into our code? And in the paper, they go on to state that a major contributor to complexity is primarily state, along with code volume and complex control flow. State, code volume, and control flow. How can we manage these with NgRx? What does NgRx have to do with these ideas? So let's jump into state first. That's what NgRx is known for. State is really just the data in your application that changes over time. It's kind of a simple definition, but it can be hard to wrap your head around. So let me try to explain it to you another way. Have you ever opened up a web app or an application on your phone, something's broken, and then someone else said, oh, just try that again, it'll work this time? Or refresh the page, I promise, that'll clear it up. Have you tried clearing your browser cache before? Oh, or my favorite, try turning it off and on again, that'll fix it. Oh, just uninstall the application and reinstall it from the App Store, that'll clear it up. Yeah, we've all had this experience when using applications. And the reasons we had these experiences when we build apps is because these applications have errors in the way they handle state. Something's gone wrong when they're handling their state. So how does NgRx handle state? Well, I want to start with a brief history of state management as it relates to Angular applications. And I'm going to steal an example from my friend Lucas Rubelke, because I believe it illustrates this problem perfectly. Who here remembers writing this kind of jQuery code, like way back in the day? A few of you, yeah, we've written this jQuery code. I know I've written a lot of code like it. And in this code, there's a lot of state, but it's mixed with a ton of different responsibilities. First, we have behavior, some kind of function that gets executed when something happens in our template. We've got a bit of state, and back in the jQuery days, we would just like store our state in data attributes in the HTML, which also meant that our state was in the same place where we changed it, so it's kind of gets really confusing already. We've also got a side effect. And a side effect is just a term for when our application needs to reach and communicate with the outside world. And this piece of code is talking directly to the template. So like this little piece of jQuery is doing so many things. It's got so many different sources of complexity between behavior, state, effects, how state changes, wiring up behaviors. It's crazy. And it's crazy because the way we handle state is so connected to the view, right? And we're storing our state in the template itself. So along comes AngularJS, and they start to really challenge the way we build single-page applications. We've isolated a lot of those away from the template. but we've only isolated it from the template. You see, we still have behaviors. The functions are getting called directly by template code. We still have state in our AngularJS controllers. Our AngularJS controllers are still changing state, and they're still reaching out to side effects. So while it started to get us further away from the view, it's not perfect. There's still a lot of complexity built in this controller. But we're starting to see a shift in the way we think about state. It's moving away from the view. Now we have Angular. And in Angular, we tend to build our Angular applications with services. These are disconnected from our view layer, and so they're no longer attached to templates or behavior. But inside of those services, we can still see some things that may seem familiar. We still have state. It's still maintaining how state changes, and there's still a side effect. We're getting really close now to the ideal solution, but we still are mixing a few too many responsibilities. And we're getting there by moving state further and further away from the view. The further we move away from the view, the less responsibilities this code tends to have. So I want to introduce to you the first part of my NgRx lasagna. Reducers, I call them the buttery pasta of this lasagna. And the way reducers are going to work is they're just going to handle state and how state changes. In a reducer function, you can see the initialization of some piece of state, and you get these really clear descriptions of how that state is going to change. But if you look at it, there's no connection to behavior. There's no template here. There's no side effects. We've really isolated the responsibilities of this code and have lifted it even further away from the view. And there's so many benefits to this. One that I'd like to highlight is the benefit that comes from unit testing. Because it's just got that one responsibility, we have a really straightforward path to testing the way our state code works. This is going to help us build better applications. Remember, I didn't write unit tests for my AngularJS app because it was a mess. This gives me an easy path to writing those unit tests. But that's not the end of the state story. Also in my NgRx lasagna, I had the ingredient of selectors. My friend Brandon likes to call selectors the secret sauce of NgRx, and he likes to call them that because they're really surprisingly powerful. You see, selectors are like database queries. But unlike database queries, they're live, they're real time, they're reactive. With your selectors, you can read in different pieces of state from your NgRx store, and you get a live view into that read. You use APIs like createSelector to leverage things like memoization to get better performance out of your applications. And when you use selectors in your components, you get an observable piece of that state to use in your templates. What I like about them is they really create this neat and clean data flow graph in your application, where data moves through it in a performance-optimized way. I want to tell you a story about selectors. I was talking to Philip Zada yesterday at Zedware, and he was telling me about this really large NgRx application he had built. And he wasn't complaining about it. Instead, he was coming to me with some bit of praise. Because the application that they were writing had this really nasty domain data model. But using selectors in the store, they were able to wrangle this data model and produce a really high-quality UI. He blamed selectors directly for how well that project turned out. So reducers and selectors are powerful ways to manage and consume state in Angular applications. So I can say that at least as it relates to state, NgRx is going to get you out of the tar pit for managing complex application state. But that's not the only thing that complexity is going to be introduced from. We also have to talk about code volume. And I know a number of you raised your hands when you were asked if you've used NgRx. So you kind of know what's coming here. But basically, code volume is simply how many lines of code it takes to achieve a task. And the idea here is that if it takes us a large number of lines of code to complete a task, then it's going to really slow down development. So how does NgRx address code volume? Do you think it's going to increase the amount of code we write in our Angular apps or decrease it? Well, the answer is unfortunately that it's sort of a sad story when it comes to code volume, because NgRx introduces a lot of boilerplate. You've all heard the term, and it's true. And it's kind of the trade-off of NgRx. NgRx is going to increase code volume. There's just no way I can get around that. I'm not going to lie to you on stage. It's going to make your code size bigger. But it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. yeah, we're increasing code volume, but boy, do we address state and control flows, so maybe there's a good trade-off here. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that boilerplate is not quite the right word for it. It's really more explicit code. If it was boilerplate, we could abstract over it in a safe way without hindering some of those other benefits. But we can't write abstractions on top of it if we want to maintain state and control flow with the same quality that we've got today. So I want to challenge you to think about NgRx in terms of code cost. Are you willing to pay that cost for the increase in code volume if it makes maintaining state and control flow just a little bit easier? I also want to point out that we're really trying to address this in the NgRx project. Some of you may have seen some of the improvements we made in NgRx 8, and if not, I kind of want to show you some of them. So this is a reducer function file today, and if you can't read it in the back, that's because it's a lot of code. This is a big, big file. And so what we've done is we've introduced new helpers that maintain all that type safety, but reduce a lot of the code. And it's called the create action and create reducer syntax. So here I've reduced all that action boilerplate down to just a few simple function calls, really reducing a lot of the code volume that was there before. And the same is true for reducers. Here I've got a big reducer function that's handling a lot of stuff, but when I introduce create reducer, it gets a whole lot smaller. So we're really trying to address this with NgRx 8, and we think we can make further optimizations down the line. So while it's not the perfect story, while we're guaranteed to make you write a little bit of extra code in NgRx, NgRx 8 is addressing the code volume problem. So what about control flow? It's the last source of complexity. Right? We've talked about state, we've talked about code volume. How does NgRx address control flow? Well, first, what is control flow? Control flow is just the order of execution in your application. How does the user interact with it? And when they interact with it, what is the order of operations that your application makes to maybe reach out to an API to take that result and to deliver it back to the user? So remember that tangle of services I showed you earlier? Well, this is a good example of a bad control flow. You can't trace how executions were happening in this application because no one thought about it. We just sort of kept building without any regards for how this application should actually make calls. So applications that have unclear control flow are going to be harder to change. Because the first time you write some new feature, that's not the last time you touch it. You're going to inevitably have to come back to that feature and introduce some step or make some change or add some kind of code branch. And when you do that to a piece of control flow that is hard to trace, it's going to be difficult to implement that change. It's also a great source of bugs. If you're not thinking about control flow up front, you're going to have tons of these little race condition bugs. And that's not great either, because they're going to be hard to track down. They're going to be hard to fix. So how does NgRx address it? How does NgRx improve control flow in Angular applications? Well, I sort of showed this reducer earlier. And you can see that there's case statements, and they refer to something called actions. And actions are my favorite. Actions are the melty ricotta of the NgRx lasagna. They bind an Angular application together and provide that glue code between disparate pieces of this architecture. Actions are going to describe unique events in our Angular apps. So when we have a unique event, we're going to write an action that describes that event. This action will have all the context that a consumer will need to be able to understand what happened in that event. When you use things like the Redux dev tools with an NgRx application, you get this really neat and clean action log that, if done correctly, will be a big boost as you onboard new developers into your application, because they can read this action log to get a very clear understanding of the order of operations in your Angular app. And when you write actions this way, you give control to reducers and effects to handle control flow. Reducers get to decide how state changes. They pick the actions out from the action log and say, these are the actions that cause this state change to occur. And effects get to use these same actions to decide when to call services. They listen for specific actions and trigger services as a result. So, how do we actually dispatch actions? Well, our components are going to inject the store, and they're going to dispatch actions using store.dispatch. And actions are going to allow us to decouple control flow from our components and move it to reducers and effects. No longer are components deciding the order of execution. They're just notifying some consumer that something interesting has happened, and reducers and effects decide what to do from there. Which reminds me, we need to talk about effects. If I'm going to really commit myself to this lasagna bit, then I have to pick some ingredient in the lasagna for effects. So I've chosen the meat. And I think it's appropriate because that's where all the business logic of your application is going to live, is in these effects. And effects are kind of interesting because you've got your component layer and they're dispatching actions, but they have no knowledge of these effects because they're these long-running processes that are running independently of your component layer. We write them using RxJS observables. So this might look a little intimidating, but let's break it down piece by piece. Effects are going to start by injecting the actions observable. And this actions observable is an event emitter of all of the actions that get dispatched in your application. If you want to listen for a specific action, you just inject the action service, apply the f-type operator to it, and you get back an observable of just those actions. Then, using RxJS operators, you can begin to compose your side effect. Here, we can use the switch map operator to call out to our API. When our API returns a response, we can map that response into a new action. NgRx will subscribe to this effect and will dispatch any new actions that come out of it back to the store for other effects and reducers to listen to. And so what's neat about this is effects allow you to model that complex control flow using observables. It may have looked complex because control flow is complex. But by describing control flow with RxJS, you have an idiomatic, community-supported way to describe how data should flow in your application. And what's great is you get really fine-grained control over race conditions. You get to pick the right mapping operator for each effect. You get to decide how cancellation works or how concurrent requests should work. You have all that control at your fingertips with RxJS. And so if we zoom out here, effects are the piece of the NgRx lasagna that allow you to control flow logic when you're communicating with your APIs. And so when it comes to control flow, I can say with some confidence that NgRx is going to help you get out of that tar pit too. It's going to make managing your control flow that much easier. So how do we make a lasagna out of Angular? Well, my favorite recipe is NgRx. Reducers, the buttery pasta of the lasagna, are going to handle state changes and give us a declarative way to make that state transition. Selectors, they're our secret sauce. They're going to deliver live updates to our components so that our UI stays in sync with our data. Actions are the melty ricotta. They're the glue code of this lasagna. They're going to provide us a really robust event stream that our different pieces of code can use to listen for changes. And effects, the meat of the NgRx app, are going to be the place where we actually maintain our control flow using RxJS. I like to say that NgRx helps you avoid spaghettification of large Angular applications. Bonus points to anyone who knows where spaghettification comes from. NgRx provides you a path out of the tar pit when it comes to maintaining or managing the complexity of state transitions and control flow logic. This makes it really well suited for those large-scale Angular applications. And I say large scale because of that code volume problem. Because it's going to increase the code cost, I only recommend it if this is an application that you're either going to spend a lot of long time building or you're building with your team. If you're on a small-sized project or even a medium-sized project, maybe NgRx isn't right for you. Consider looking into other alternatives like NgXS and Akita. But if I was to leave you with one idea, it's to eat more lasagna, right? I want you to think up front the next time you build an Angular application how you're going to handle complex control flow, state, and code volume. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about NgRx with the time we have remaining.
So we've got a few questions in the Slack channel. Do jump in and put some more in there as well. I don't know, all that talk of spaghetti and lasagna has got me hungry, but I think we've got a little while to field some of these questions. So There's one, can you explain good code hygiene?
Good code hygiene?
Yeah.
So, good code hygiene. I'm wondering if they're referring to good action hygiene, perhaps?
Phil, are you in the room?
Phil? Well, I'm going to assume that the question was for good action hygiene then, because that's a pretty common phrase that comes up when we're talking about NgRx. So good action hygiene is this idea that you want to be deliberate when you write actions for your NgRx application. I have a full talk about it, a full 20-minute bit that you can watch on YouTube if you type in Good Action Hygiene by Mike Ryan. And the idea with good action hygiene is that every unique event in your application gets a unique action that describes that event. And you want to be really descriptive with both the action type and the data that goes on it. And the reason for that is really sourced from empathy for your fellow developers. I've gotten to work on teams where we've built large NgRx applications, and it makes a world of difference if other team members can come onto your code and understand what it's doing. So by being deliberate with those actions, you're making the dev tools in NgRx that much more valuable because other developers on your team can use those dev tools to get an understanding of your app. So that's kind of the idea. It's really just an empathetic way to build NgRx applications.
So there's another question that you covered off a little bit. The question is, when is my app big enough to use NgRx? And I guess you talked about small and medium maybe not being that. What might go into the consideration for when to start bringing it into your app?
Yeah, so I've talked about code size in this talk, so I won't hit on that again. But another consideration is, how many different sources of change do you have in your Angular app? I see a lot of developers that use NgRx for applications that are just talking to a REST API and have a little bit of user interaction. And NgRx just isn't well suited for that. I'm like, yeah, you can use it and it'll be fine, but you're not going to get a lot of benefit out of the architecture. But if you have many sources of change, maybe like a WebSocket connection and you're using a lot of browser APIs and you've got a REST API and it's a really interactive UI, then NgRx starts to make more sense because you're going to get a lot of value out of the way it unifies each of those sources of change.
There's a question about the things to come in NgRx. So what should we look out for? What are you most excited about?
I'll give you a teaser. I shouldn't because I'm supposed to talk about it next week and unveil it, but I'll talk about it today a little bit.
Will you have to turn the cameras off?
No, we can keep the cameras on. It's fine. So we have a massive new library coming out, probably in a year's time frame. So we're talking about far future. But it's called NgRx Component. And it's not related to state management or side effects at all. Instead, what we're doing is we're leveraging a lot of the new APIs that are coming out in Ivy to give you reactive APIs for building Angular components. So if you've wanted a really good way to have maybe reactive lifecycle hooks or reactive events from the template or reactive inputs, NgRx Component is going to get you there. So I'm really excited about that project. There's an issue open on our GitHub. So I think it's prefixed with RFC, and it's got full details. It's written up by Michael Hladky, all about this new library that we're intending to implement in the coming year.
I can see a couple of people typing.
I think I was filmed by one person, too, that I suspect would go on Twitter quickly.
So while we're waiting for those messages to finish, does anyone have a question want to show by raise of hands? Got one, of course, down the back.
I was just have a quick question. Do you have slides or video already of this talk?
Do I have slides available? I can make them available, and I'll put them in the Slack later today. Though I have to warn you, like, my slides are kind of sparse and they're not super valuable on their own, but I'll be happy to post them. Any other questions?
I've got one more question here. NgRx is like the Redux pattern. What impressions do you have of React hooks?
That's a good question. So the question was, what's my impression of React hooks? And I've actually gotten to spend a good bit of time writing React over the past 6 to 9 months at my day job. And we've used exclusively function components with hooks. And what they remind me of is, we used to write this promise-based code, and then we had async await. And it's hard to do this without slides, without comparison. So just imagine for a moment that when you used a promise, you called .then on it. So all of your stuff would happen to the right of calling a promise. When you introduced async await, suddenly all the stuff happened to the left. And when you have all your code to the left, I found that it's a little bit easier to write. Async await was easier for me to write and get my head around than the promise-based code I used to write before. React hooks and the similar hooks that are coming out in Vue, they move reactivity to the left. Where in an Angular app with RxJS, we've got all of it to the right. So when I'm building these kinds of reactive applications with some of these early APIs in React and Vue, I'm just really excited because it makes building reactive applications so much more pleasant. And I hope that as an Angular ecosystem, we don't sort of shy away from them because there's some really brilliant ideas coming out from them.
Does NgRx lend itself to managing state control as in a state machine?
Yes, definitely. There's a really excellent library called xstate, which allows you to model complex state machines in JavaScript. And what's great about it is if you build up the state machine in a library like xstate, you can call that state machine directly in your reducers. So reducers can be just an entry point to calling some other state machine. So it really plays really well with state machine libraries.
What approach would you go with in refactoring spaghetti code with lots of service that have their own state?
Yeah, so the first approach to refactoring spaghetti code, if it's the same kind of spaghetti code like the one that I wrote, is to start by running tests. It might seem backwards to write tests for code you want to replace, but by writing tests for it, you're going to get a better understanding of how that code operates. And if you kind of write them in black box testing strategy, when you go to replace that code later, you've got validation that the new code you've replaced it with is behaving the way you'd expect. So my advice, if you're going to refactor a spaghetti app, start with the tests. It's going to be the best way to unpack what that code is doing.
Can you combine version 7 syntax with version 8 syntax?
Definitely. So in version 7 and before, you would use maybe classes for your actions, and you'd use functions for your reducers. In version 8, you're going to start using create action and create reducer. The great part of create action and create reducer is they're just building those same data structures and functions that you're using before, so you can intermix them. It's totally fine, and it's a good incremental way to start adopting some of those new patterns.
We've got some more typing going on. Any others that I can run to? Or walk would be preferable, maybe one of these tables close.
Oh, there's a question there.
So, with good action hygiene, you mentioned being explicit about your actions. Really, rather than actions, they're more actually events that are triggered in UI. How do you avoid coupling your UI to your state if you have to be explicit about what event triggers state updates?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's another aspect of good action hygiene, is that it's impossible to get completely disconnected from how state changes and how your UI operates. But at some part in your application, you have to decide who has the responsibility of making that decision. So in NgRx, there's kind of two competing ideas for how you write actions. The first is actions as commands, and then there's good action hygiene. Actions as commands is sort of the opposite approach, where you've got a narrow set of actions that are going to give you intent about what's going to happen when you dispatch it. And with actions as commands, you're saying that your components decide how state transitions and how effects start. That's one approach. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it, but in good action hygiene, you invert that decision-making process. So now your components are just emitting events. They're not making decisions over how state changes or how side effects start. Instead, you've moved that responsibility to your reducers and effects to choose exactly which events cause a state transition to occur or a side effect to start. So it's just about where does that responsibility live.
Okay, do we have any more questions in the room? Any jokes? Did you hear the one about the web designer that walked into the bar and immediately left? Didn't like the tables layout?
Oh.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's give Mike a round of applause then.
Thank you.
So we've got a few minutes before the next talk starts. At 12 o'clock, we've got Deanna in here talking about when virtual DOM diffing is a little too clever. And across the way, we've got Phil talking about web sharing is web caring. So if you want to maybe make your way, either stay here or make your way into the expo room to grab a coffee before the next session, just remember that there's another talk still going on in the other room, so keep it down. Thank you very much. See you in a few minutes.